Now we're ready to look at the third line of immunity. Third line, remember, is your adaptive immunity. This is your most powerful weapon against infection, but it also has a delayed response. The reason for that delayed response is because it is specific. Your third line works by identifying the pathogen that is infecting you and then creating a custom response to that particular pathogen. And the cells that you use to do this are called lymphocytes. So the third line of immunity is all about lymphocytes. We have 3 types of lymphocytes we're going to cover in this class. If you take a more detailed class about immunity, you would learn other lymphocytes, but we just have 1 chapter in immunity and we're just going to learn 3 of them. So the 3 that we are going to learn are helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells, and B cells. First, we're going to look at the production of these cells. So remember in chapter 21, we learned about the lymphatic system and primary and secondary lymphatic structures. So the top picture here is your primary lymphatic structures. Here is red bone marrow. It makes all 3 lymphocytes, the helper T, cytotoxic T, and B. So all lymphocytes come from the red bone marrow. But once a lymphocyte is made, it next has to be matured. The B cells are called B because they stay in the bone marrow, so B for bone, and that's where they mature. So B cells mature in the bone marrow. All right, then do you remember this gland from chapter 21? Remember it's larger in children and shrinks in adults? This is the thymus, and this is where T cells mature. And that's how they got their name, T cells, because they mature in the thymus gland. Once the cells are mature, they go to your secondary lymphatic structures. So we have here a lymph node. We have the spleen. And we have tonsils. These are serving as examples of secondary lymphatic structures. They are what house mature lymphocytes. Now let's take a look at what it means to be a mature lymphocyte. Here we have naive immunocompetent lymphocytes. Naive means that they have not fought a pathogen yet. It's like they're fresh out of training, they're ready to go, but they haven't yet done battle. Immunocompetent means that they're mature and they're ready to. And being mature means that they have their receptors. The receptors are the key to how lymphocytes work. We take a look at receptors. Receptors are proteins on the surface of the lymphocyte. And they are going to interact with pathogens. This is what they use to identify and interact with pathogens. And you have several different receptors. And which receptors you have is genetic. You inherit it from your parents. So you inherit several different receptors from your parents. Each individual lymphocyte only has one type of receptor on it, but then you have several different lymphocytes. So, for example, this might be lymphocyte number 1, and it has this receptor. Here's lymphocyte number 2. It has a receptor like this. Here's lymphocyte number 3. It has a receptor like this. The shape of your receptors is from your parents. So you have a variety of receptors, each on a different lymphocyte, that you inherit from your parents. These receptors are what you use to identify and fight the pathogens. Let's look at the 3 lymphocytes, are helper T, cytotoxic T, and B cells, and see which receptors they have. The blue is for helper T. We have 2 different proteins here on the surface. This hook-shaped one is CD4, and this funnel-shaped one is TCR. So helper Ts have CD4. This is a protein that interacts with cells of your body. The funnel-shaped one is the TCR. This is the one that identifies and interacts with pathogens. This is the one that comes in different shapes. Next, we have cytotoxic T. This has CD8 and TCR. Same function. So CD8 interacts with your cells. And TCR, that's the one that you inherit several different kinds from your parents, is what you use to identify and interact with pathogen. Then we have the B cell. It only has one type of protein, which is the BCR. And just like TCR, it will identify and interact with the pathogen. So just to show a little more about the idea of these receptors and how they work. Here we have some pathogens. We have a bacteria and we have a virus, examples of pathogens. And you can see they have these things on their surface. Those are antigens. We talked about antigens before in Chapter 18 with your blood. The antigens on your red blood cells are what give you your blood type. So here again, we have antigens. They are just a protein on the surface of the cell. And remember, proteins come in different shapes. So each antigen has a particular shape, and the shape is specific to that species. So you use the antigens of the pathogen to identify which species you are sick with. We look down here at the bottom picture. These are the antigens. So we have a purple triangle, a blue circle, and a blue square. The yellow things are the receptors of your lymphocytes. So let's give ourselves 3 lymphocytes again. So here are your lymphocytes. Here are your receptors. Okay, remember, you have lots of different receptors that you inherited from your parents, each on a different lymphocyte. So we have 1, 2, and 3. You use those receptors to identify and fight the pathogen. So this bacteria, this pathogen right here, its receptor or its antigens would fit these receptors. So if this bacteria were in you making you sick, you would use lymphocyte number 2 to fight it. The virus here, its antigens match these receptors. So if this virus were in you making you sick, you would use lymphocyte number 1 to fight it. So this is how lymphocytes are specific. Their receptors match up to the antigens of pathogens. And then once you find that match, that's the lymphocyte that you use to fight that particular pathogen. Let's write a summary of that just so you have it. So we're going to say a pathogen invades you. You have to find your lymphocyte with receptors that match the pathogen's antigen. Then that is the lymphocyte you will use to fight that pathogen. This is the whole specific aspect of the third line of immunity. And the reason it has a delay is you first have to find the one that matches. And then once you find it, you take some time to clone it because one lymphocyte can't by itself fight a whole infection. It has to build up an army of lymphocytes that all have that same receptor to then go fight the infection.